Yeah, so my name is David. I'm an MPhil student here, and I'm in the engineering department. I do research in computational neuroscience, and I'll try and give you a little introduction to some concepts in the field, and also talk about the project I'm working on using uncertainty in the way we perceive the world to study what the brain may be doing, basically in any sort of inference problem. So first, I'd just like to thank my advisor. I'm from the Computational Biological Learning Lab, and he's made a lot of good slides and figures that I've borrowed some from. So if you see something really impressive, I might not have made it myself. Okay. So about 1 year ago, there was a pretty big event in social media and pop culture history. I remember where I was when it happened. I was at a swim meet back in the United States, and it was after the meet, and I was checking my Twitter feed, and people on my team were doing this at the same time, and a picture of this dress showed up on the feed. So, I mean, of course I saw it in blue and black, but does anyone here see it in white and gold? Yeah. It's obviously white. I tell you, they try so many different ways to make you see it in both colors. I always see it blue and black. And that's just something that's amazing about our brains. So you can think of this in some sort of like ambiguity about perceptions, where we're looking at the same image, but we have a different perception of what the image is. Our brain realizes it differently. So.
Sorry, I have a question. So the very thing at the top, do you see that as black or blue?
This?
Yeah.
Black. Even though that's the closest to gold. But I'd still see it as black, at least on this side.
So do I get blue.
Yeah. So I won't talk about the dress specifically any longer, but there's a class at NYU taught by a professor named Weijie Ma, who talks all about these types of illusions and inferences and perception, and the class wrote a blog about why our brain might be, why the difference in the perception is happening. And I'll talk about things that are similar, just not the dress exactly. This is a very similar problem, and you may have seen this image before as well, where we have a checkerboard with different tiles, and the question is, what color are these two tiles A and B? Are they the same color? Are they different color? Is one lighter or darker than the other? And I'm sure you can see, generally your initial percept might be that B is lighter than A, but also you might know this is an illusion and think there's something more going on, and realize that, of course, they're actually the same color. Has anyone not seen that before and is amazed? Emily. So, and this is another example of this problem where everyone is receiving the same sensory input. In this case, instead of having different perceptions, or we still may have different perceptions, but also our perception may be wrong. We thought initially we think this tile is lighter than the other one, but for some reason, we see them in that way for some reason, but they end up being the same color in the end. And this is just an example of our brain solving an inference problem. Basically, we're combining our prior knowledge about the world with some sensory stimulus into our percept. And I'll formalize that as we go. But that is kind of the problem that we talk about in general, that my lab and a lot of other people in some areas of computational neuroscience do, is they talk about how our brain works in some sort of probabilistic manner to combine things in the world with our prior knowledge. So I'll just give a quick background on probabilistic inference. We can think of probabilities. If anyone's unfamiliar with anything or has any questions, just let me know. But if we have some variable, maybe x in the environment, where it could be a stimulus and we're trying to say what value is the stimulus taking, or if x could be some event occurring in the environment, and the probability of this event occurring will fall somewhere between 0 and 1. And we can think of probabilities as beliefs, whereas if we have a probability of 0, we believe that this event is never going to happen. Probability of 1, we believe it will always happen, and all sorts of things in between. And that's just some sort of prior assumption maybe about this variable x, how it behaves in the environment. Now let's say we observe some piece of evidence, y, and then we have a new probability distribution, the probability of x given that we've seen this observation y. It's still a probability distribution, it's still a way of representing our beliefs, but now we have some more information and it might be more accurate or it might better reflect the state of the world. And the rules of probability tell us how to kind of combine these sources of information. The sources of information are background knowledge and also what we're perceiving in the world to compute these conditional probabilities. If you have used Bayes' rule, you combine your prior knowledge about the world with the likelihood of evidence you've seen given any sort of stimulus in the world. And if you multiply the two together, it's proportional to the probability of x, the stimulus, given your observation. So why does it make sense to use probabilities, use them to represent your beliefs? Why would it make sense at all? Like, first, this is an optimal way of combining prior and new knowledge, but also there's a theorem, the Dutch book theorem, which I won't prove, but it basically says that if you're willing to bet on your beliefs, that unless your beliefs satisfy the axioms of probability, there will always exist a set of bets that guarantee that you will lose your money no matter what the outcome is of an event. So basically it's saying if your beliefs don't follow the rules of probability, then you're not acting very rational, at least in some ways. Now humans don't always act rationally, but let's say at least in some ways it makes sense to represent beliefs as probability. Hello. Okay, so if we go back to this checkerboard problem, you can think of the prior knowledge as being some sort of information we know about checkerboards and shadows, namely that the tiles of checkerboards alternate in colors, or at least shades of darkness, and then a shadow will make something appear darker than it actually is. So if we just start assuming it's a checkerboard, we think it's very light, and you can think of this as our prior knowledge, this red curve here. We say, okay, this is a checkerboard, and there's a shadow on it. So this piece is most likely light, as it would fall on one of these diagonals. But then we have this other sense of evidence from the world, the light actually reflecting off the square, which tells us, this is the blue curve, that it's actually a dark square. It actually has the same color as A. And these two senses of evidence, our knowledge and the evidence in the world, they conflict. And then when we combine them, we get some sort of in-between color. And this is just an example of the probability rules occurring in action, and the similar things like this happen in the dress example, and there's many other effects, well-known effects that have shown this, yeah.
So, are you sort of assuming that our brain solves an inference problem?
Yes, but not stating how.
But could it be the case that our brain, for example, doesn't follow the rules of probability? Like given a certain set of observations, there's something inconsistent with laws of probability?
Yes, it's certainly possible. The hard part is how the brain would actually compute and do these compute probabilities, represent them, and also do them in an optimal manner. So if it's even approximating certain things, then you might not see this, the correct behavior. But this is an actual example of a case where our behavior does follow the laws of probability, and there's been many studies that I'll detail one quickly that actually show that we do follow the rules of probability in certain cases.
Okay. Well, cool.
Yeah. I think I just alluded to what I was going to talk about next, where we've somehow envisioned where it looks like we're using laws of probability to combine previous knowledge of the world with our sensory inputs. Now, this is an example in sensory motor control. This is a paper published in 2002 in Nature by two guys named Ernst and Banks. And basically, I'll quickly explain, is that they show that if we're dealing with some sort of object in the world and we have visual inputs and tactile or haptic feedback, then we combine these two cues about the object in an optimal way under the laws of probability. I'm not prepared to detail the entire experiment, but basically they varied the amount of noise that was, if we imagine the two cues, the visual cue and the tactile cue, and over many different trials, they varied the reliability of the cues. One might give you good information about, okay, sorry, I guess I didn't explain. They're trying to look at and feel a ridge, and they're trying to guess the height of this ridge based on what their feedback from touch is telling them and what their feedback from vision is telling them. And the feedback is different. You can see that they're not actually seeing the ridge, so that the experimenters can manipulate the reliability of the visual and haptic cues independently of the other. So they may be conflicting in some cases. You may be feeling something that's really high, but looking at something that's really short. And obviously, in one case, you might not be able to figure out how to combine those pieces of information. But they varied the reliability of the visual and tactile cues, basically made it more or less noisy. And it was shown that the subjects actually learned to weight the cue that was more reliable, basically following some maximum likelihood estimators of the most likely stimulus, yeah.
So couldn't one interpretation of this experiment be that as you average the results over multiple people?
I'm sure they don't average over multiple people. It's subject by subject.
Okay.
And they do some more things where they looked at like their discriminability between certain stimulus and thresholds, and it's pretty high quality. And I mean, it got into Nature, so they looked at a lot of different possible. They ruled out a lot of possible alternative explanations. But yeah, if you're more interested, it's not even that long of a paper. I suggest it's like 3 or 4 pages. So just looking into it. Anyways, this is all kind of background work to set up the type of research that I'm doing. And I've kind of explained in a couple points. First, that these probabilistic inference, they're a rational, optimal way to represent beliefs and combine evidence from the world along with what we know already. And humans also follow this behavior. So the questions, of course, are how? What kind of computations could we be doing? What measures, or how do we represent probability distributions? How do we compute them in the first place? How do we integrate evidence and all these different things in the world? And that's some of the research project that I've been working on here. Yeah.
When you say probabilistic, you say, I guess the brain's taking multiple stimulus and then creating some kind of output, which is your perception, right? Why?
It could even be that you have one stimulus and you're not sure about it. And having a probability distribution inherently represents uncertainty. So
I guess what I'm thinking is, do you mean you're taking in stimulus and then there's a certain probability of what your brain is gonna make its perception, and then you stick to that perception? Or like, because like for example, with the dress case, right?
Yeah.
I'm taking in the same stimulus, but if there's a probability distribution, shouldn't I see this like different things every time?
I think it's more that you have some sort of notion of uncertainty, that you recognize that there's something that may not be correct, or that you're more unsure about what the colors are than. And in the dress example, I'm not exactly sure how to answer that question, because I do get what you're saying, where you think.
Because I'm thinking like, what if there's.
Honestly, what might be happening is we have different prior knowledge. We have different priors about what the colors of which way lights should combine together, and that's what's causing the different percepts. So someone might, I guess we're all receiving the same sensory input, most likely, unless there's some differences in our eyes. But we might have a different internal representation of what light should look like that reflects off certain colors and certain luminances and things like that.
Because I guess when I think of the word probabilistic, I think all the time there's different outcomes, and then you can get a reliable average and variance and things like that. But I don't see why people just couldn't take the inputs and like get an output in a deterministic manner, but the deterministic manner varies from person to person. So, like, when you say probabilistic, what do you mean by that?
Basically, that they're combining prior knowledge and sensory evidence in a probabilistic way using Bayes' rule. It doesn't have to necessarily, your outcome doesn't necessarily have to change every time, but it may.
Yeah, because outcome having the possibility to change is what I associate with probabilistic.
Yeah. I associate that with it too. But also, you can also think of it as an inference problem where you're solving it using Bayes' rule, which is probabilistic.
And then once you get like a solution, your brain just sticks to that. So you're saying the first solution, there's a probability distribution, but then once you get the same input, then you only get the same answer after that. So there's like a lapse.
You can have probabilistic methods which have deterministic outputs but use probability internally to construct a deterministic output. Like the model is probabilistic even though the output might not necessarily be probabilistic. Sorry, the model is probabilistic even though the output might not necessarily be probabilistic.
What do you, if the model is probabilistic, then like you can get different outputs every time. Don't think that
the framework is probabilistic, not necessarily like.
What is deterministic is like things like the.
How they combine together basically is the deterministic part. How they combine together and how we use that.
Would be like the average and the variance if you have a probability distribution that isn't changing. That is deterministic, but the outcome per measurement is still probabilistic.
Certainly.
If you have a probability distribution.
Yeah. I mean, the outcome on trial by trial basis you might have differences, but basically what I'm trying to say is that these mechanisms are, the inference is done probabilistically, taking into account your uncertainty and taking into account different sources of information.
I guess my question.
And I definitely wouldn't say that you always have the same reaction or action to not every time, because that is clearly not true. I mean, we do different things all the time based on, yeah.
To add to that, the next time you look at it, your prior could be slightly different, right? Because you could have, like, I don't know, seen someone else's opinion, or the next time. So, like, the brain is going to converge on, like, it's only going to show you one thing every time you look at it, right? So the brain has some way of converging to, like, this is the representation I'm going to show the person. Like, this is what I think. But the next time you see it, your prior could be slightly different. Again, you might have read.
Or you could receive a little bit of different information from the stimulus and many different things like
prior,
that.
I guess, could like swamp out whatever previous.
I mean, it's a combination of both, but like every time you look at it, the distributions are not the same.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's good.
Yes, Daniel.
Well, so it could be. I mean, couldn't it be the case that our brain, from an external perspective, appears to be acting probabilistic, although internally there might not necessarily be any, so our brain might not have any internal notion of like what a prior is.
Definitely. That's definitely possible, because also there was a recent paper about a month ago where people trained a neural network based just to minimize squared error. They didn't train it on any probabilistic feedback, and the neural network is deterministic based on its inputs, but it still behaved like it was doing probabilistic inference. So yeah, it doesn't make it it's not a sufficient condition, I think. It doesn't mean for sure that the brain is doing probabilistic inference, but people do look at the variability in neural activity and populations of neurons and how that varies. And there are some evidence there that that's where the evidence more comes from, that the brain is, this is behavioral, but neurally there is some evidence from population activity as well. I'm not as well versed to tell you about it right now, but yeah. Okay, so yeah, I keep mainly to the behavioral stuff right now. We're studying this problem, what the brain how we might be doing these probabilistic computations under the framework of perceptual uncertainty. And what are some examples of that? Here we have a stimulus with two lines that are, or pairs of lines that are crossing each other. And let's say you ask someone which set of lines was on top of the other. Well, obviously you could interpret it either way, and because there's no evidence for either one, and of course you have some uncertainty about which lines are actually on top of each other. At least you can't tell the difference from this picture. Another example is the photoreceptors in our retina are inherently noisy. Given the same visual input, they may not always, or they will not always give the same information to the visual cortex in the brain. It may not be that different on each trial, but it's definitely not exact. It's not an exact process. So that gives us inherent source of uncertainty in the world. Another thing is if we're looking at a picture, another example is if this picture is dark and if there's very low contrast, it might be harder for us to distinguish features in the background or other areas, and we'll be more uncertain about what we actually see in a certain location. And there's even more examples. For example, the world, the entire world is 3D, but it gets projected onto a 2D mapping into our retina and brain, and that leaves inherent ambiguity in what we may be seeing, and then you may not even have all the information necessary to do an accurate perception. So all of these are examples of this problem of, or this phenomenon of uncertainty in perception, and we're going back to this probabilistic thing where we're trying to see the probability of a feature in the environment given, some sensory stimulus. What we're studying to help this is what processes the brain may be doing to compute these probabilities, and we're using time as a sort of variable to manipulate to look for signatures of different processes. So when you can imagine having how long you're perceiving a stimulus is what we're manipulating, for how long this one of these pictures may be presented to you. And that gives you a certain amount of time that you're receiving information about it, and that is what we're manipulating in our experiment. And I'll detail the experiment later on.
Is there like a characteristic time scale? Are we talking like seconds or like minutes, hours?
Milliseconds. Yeah. So there's two kind of well-known hypotheses about what the brain is using time to do when it's collecting information about the world, maybe to make a decision. The first, pretty well established, is called evidence integration, simply meaning that throughout time we are collecting evidence and then integrating it with our current and prior knowledge in a probabilistic manner. Another one, somewhat more less proven but very interesting, is called sampling, where instead of the evidence integration thing may require that we represent probabilities exactly throughout time, but if instead perhaps our brain is, the neural activity is sampling from a probability distribution, then maybe that's one way that we could represent and do probabilistic computations. Yeah, Daniel?
Will these actually represent, could both of these models give rise to the same behaviors? Like, is it possible to distinguish them?
At least in our formulation, you may be able to distinguish them. But they both, in the certain type of, they may both be doing probabilistic inference, and you may get to the same result at the end. But one of the way we study it, we think we at least have a way to distinguish between the two. They're not, I wouldn't say they're even mutually exclusive in general. It's just these two processes are, we formulate exclusive models that might show us, based on how long we present a stimulus, what may be going on. So I'll detail these two models a little more. So evidence integration, it's a general term for multiple different types of ways in which the brain may make decisions. So this first model is called, it's like sequential decision making. And basically, you're saying that maybe we start with a certain evidence point, and then at each time after you collect a piece of evidence, you decide either to stop and make a decision, or you decide to collect another piece of evidence because you're not sure enough yet, or something like that. And you can keep on doing that until you're ready to make a decision. And there's probably a lot more going on, but that's all I'll say about it, at least right now. And then another example is, you can imagine if you're making a decision between two options, you can think of some sort of decision variable, where if you reach a bound on either of these, in either direction, you might make the decision in one way. So people model that by saying, let's say we have a particle that starts in exactly halfway in between the two decision bounds, if you have no prior way to lean towards either decision. And then this particle just drifts with some diffusion, but it drifts to one of the bounds depending on the evidence in either way. So if you have strong evidence in towards one decision, then it'll drift very quickly and more likely hit that bound, but maybe not. So these are just a couple of examples of what evidence integration, different models for that. You right, Daniel? Okay. Okay. The next model, the potential process to represent probabilities or use probabilities is called sampling. And for people who don't know, sampling is a process where you basically you draw. I mean, I hate to use the name and when I'm explaining it, but let's say you draw a sample from the world, and if you collect many of these samples, they will follow the probability distribution. If you, the likelihood of you receiving a sample at a certain point will follow the probability of that state being in the world, basically. But you can think of that in neural activity as saying, let's say two neurons are being receptive to two different stimuli in the world, and there are actually two features given the same stimuli. And we say there's some probability of the two different features taking their values given this stimulus. And we say the two neurons may represent these, maybe responding to the two different feature values in such a way that their responses, sorry?
What value?
It could be anything. I mean, this could be the contrast between the two, like this is light, that may be dark, or basically any sort of feature that you can imagine in the stimulus, whether there's a pole there, whether this is dark, whether it's different from something. Yeah, but basically that the cells, the responses trace out the probability distribution. So it's not that the cells are representing at any given time the whole probability distribution, but over a long period of time, their activity aligns with the distribution. Does anyone have any questions? Because I don't know if I've explained them in the best way, but does anyone at least feel like they understand that there's two different processes that we're looking at and how they may differ?
I don't understand how the existence of contrast initially as a probability distribution. I can understand that we might build one by sampling, but like you can look at the pixel count, or you can look at like the pixel intensity on the computer screen. And you can find an actual value. There's not like a probability distribution associated with that.
Yeah, I think it's more, this may be a little bit more of a toy example where it may not necessarily be exactly, but I think you do have variability in your responses, like neurons have variability, so that for the same stimulus, you might have a different response, but it's more likely to have a certain response given a certain stimulus. So there is inherent variability in neural responses that, given the same thing, you will not always get the same activity. Yeah.
I was gonna say, I mean, neurons are also like sensors, so like there's sensor noise in any measurement. So even if a neuron is supposed to respond to like a patch of light, it will on most occasions, but it also won't.
Yeah. Okay. So now I'll talk about the actual experiment that we're doing. It's psychophysical, which means we're manipulating kind of evidence and we're looking at behavior. We're not doing any sort of neural recording or anything, but I think it's pretty interesting. And I'll first just go through the exact steps, what someone doing the experiment, what the subject will see. So first, we have them fixate on a dot in the center of a screen. And then we present them with stimulus, which is a set of lines placed around this dot. And the number of lines varies on each trial from 1 to 6. Could be any of those drawn uniformly. And also the contrast or the darkness of each of the lines also varies, also drawn randomly from certain contrast values. And so the subject sees the stimulus for another variable amount of time, either for 60 or 50 to 600 milliseconds. And that is kind of the key variable that we manipulate, how long we present this stimulus to the subject. I guess if you can think of it, two different variables. How difficult is a trial going to be, and then how long do we present it? So the task as a subject is we cover up the stimulus with a mask of noise and indicate kind of in the general vicinity one of these lines. You can see in this one, it's this line here. We indicated that line. And the subject's task is to draw on the screen to try and match the orientation of this line. That's the task of the subject. Not only do they have to match the orientation, but they also want to try and represent how confident they are that they are matching the orientation as well. So you can imagine if they're drawing a line, like if this was a true orientation, and obviously they're very far off here, but if they drew a line, they're trying to draw a line that matches it, and that's the first point of their response. But the second one is also how long they draw the line indicates their confidence about how close they are to the true orientation. So in this setup, we get two different quantities. We can measure how close they are to the true orientation. So we get their error, and then also we get their uncertainty or their confidence based on their own subjective report, which is not always reliable, but we've at least looked at the data and seen that it is reliable in this case. So given our models, we develop probabilistic models for evidence integration and probabilistic sampling to look at how these quantities, the error and the uncertainty, will change on each of these trials based on how long the stimulus is being presented and how difficult the trials are and how much do they vary. And basically we have some model curves that may be happening. The main quantities of interest, if we do this over many different trials, is what is the average error and the average uncertainty across trials, and also what is the correlation between the two as a function of the presentation time of the stimulus. These curves are just theoretical possibilities for our model, but the examples of what we may predict. Yeah, Daniel?
So I have two questions. The first question is, people tend to get better at experiments as you give them this, if you give them the same type of experiment multiple times, which seems to indicate that there's some sort of learning going on. And so could it be the case, for example, that like your actual perception or like your reaction to the stimulus can actually change like by neural connections forming over time? So if you do this,
Yeah.
What I'm asking is, if you do this experiment with the same person and try to use that as your data, couldn't you get some sort of that effect happening?
Yeah, and part of it is, we even train people to be good at the task. Because it's actually really tough to represent how uncertain you are, to learn how to represent uncertain you are just by drawing the length of a line. So we have some mapping that the subjects have to learn how to follow, because it's not clear what uncertainty even means when you draw the length of the line initially. So they're trained on the task anyways. So there definitely is some learning going on. But the most important part is that not that they're getting better at the task, like that's okay, but they actually don't get that much better. Because based on the difficulty, it might be really hard to improve. But what's most important is that they learn how to, it's not that they're getting better, but they're still reporting their error and uncertainty on every single trial. And that's what we're interested in. Not as much if the error is closer to zero, that doesn't matter as much as we're more interested in the relationship between the two.
Okay, so in the future, are you basically taking one person and doing a lot of trials on that one person, or taking like multiple?
We have multiple people, and each one of them does 4,000 to 5,000 trials. So it's over 4 or 5 sessions, but yeah. But I think currently we have 7 subjects. We're getting more.
Okay. So what are these curves? You have error and uncertainty on the...
So this is up here for the 2 different models. We have theoretical predictions for what? The average error and the average uncertainty They're the same. The average error and uncertainty they're overlapping.
They're overlapped.
Yeah, yeah.
Function of time.
Yes.
And the time is the time you present the stimulus for?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then in sampling, you can think of time as how many samples
So the error
you've drawn.
goes to 1 if you let the sample flash for 100 milliseconds.
So the time axis is not exactly milliseconds because we don't have a clear mapping between time and either number of samples you have or number of evidence points you have. So for sampling, this axis here represents how many samples you have from the world, and this axis here represents how many evidence points
These
you
are
have.
based on the experiments.
No. It doesn't. It wouldn't exactly align with the experiment, and there's other reasons too why it won't.
Okay.
So that's part of the tricky part is that it may not even be possible to exactly simulate the experiment or derive exact theoretical predictions. But at least we have things that are similar.
Wait, explain one time what the y-axis is?
So here it's the average. I'm only applying here the average error, the mean error across trials, as a function of how long the stimulus is presented. And here are curves saying the correlation between the error and uncertainty across trials. So if you have all the trials, you have a vector of your errors, vector uncertainty, what's the correlation between the two? And these are just, these different colors represent different parameters in the model. Yeah.
So when you say how long they draw the line, sorry, do you mean like the length of the line or how long they take to draw?
The length of the line.
Okay, do you also at any point think, like factor in how long they take to either like start drawing it or like how long they like stretch out drawing it for uncertainty?
Yeah. Well, no, not for uncertainty. But we do look at those to make sure that people are making sure they're doing it quickly and they're not taking a long time to deliberate, or basically that it's a immediate response, which is what we desire. So given that experiment, we want to make sure first.
So do we go back to the previous
Yeah. Sorry. Get some more pictures. I should have a way to just go between.
Okay, so if I'm understanding this correctly, evidence integration would indicate that as you give them more time, the error and uncertainty will become uncorrelated?
No, they'll still be correlated. If you're looking at this one, this is just the error.
Okay.
And this is the simplest model of evidence integration we have. We have more complicated ones that are more realistic because based on this model, your error is going to go to 0 if you collect all that evidence in the world, basically is what it's saying.
Okay.
Whereas in sampling, that's not always true. And then these ones are the correlation, and neither of them go to 0.
Oh, I see. Oh, okay, that makes more sense. Okay, thanks.
But if you had noise in evidence integration, and your error did go to 0, and your uncertainty both went to 0, and then the only thing you had left was some uncorrelated noise, then it would be uncorrelated in the end. But yeah. So given this experiment, we want to make sure first are the subjects actually completing the task as we desire. So these are just charts of the stimulus orientations presented on all the trials, and then the reported orientations of the subjects just collected across probably all the subjects, I think. And it's not perfect, but it seems that they're perceiving the right orientations, and they're not biased towards any differences in orientation. So if you plot the stimulus angle versus the subject's response angle, in general, they may have deviations, but there's not a systematic deviation in either way. And also when they're drawing the lines, it's a quick draw and there's no extra deliberation or something that may be influencing them. Which is, because it's also been shown that ballistic moments have like smaller noise, but if you take longer to think about what you're drawing and things like that, then there's a lot more things at play than just the simple error and your immediate uncertainty representation. Okay, so, and we looked at, is this representation of probability, are they representing the probabilities? Is this calibrated representation? So we have different plots of, based on, for one subject, the error they made. So this one is small errors, and these ones are the biggest errors from their reported for stimulus orientations. And it's just binned in certain ranges. And you can see for the smallest errors, we are mapping them. They have the smallest, the width of the probability distribution is the smallest, which indicates that they're the most, in general, the most certain during this case. So basically, since the widths of the distributions get larger as the errors get larger, it indicates that they do have some sort of calibrated representation and a probability representation where if the error is higher, they know that they're less confident about it. They're less confident about their decision. And this behavior appears in multiple different subjects. And we also looked at the relationship between the error and uncertainty, just a linear regression, but I won't go into that right now. And then also we looked at, I mentioned how we have different numbers of lines presented to the subjects and different contrasts. And that kind of varies the task difficulty for each trial. If you have many different lines and they're low contrast, it'll be harder to match the orientation of one of them that we indicate. And basically, we just see that in this, when we look at how controlling for these different variables, that yeah, when the task gets more difficult, the uncertainty and error go up, but that doesn't affect. Basically, what it just shows is it doesn't affect the relationship between the two. No matter how difficult the trial was, we still have some single representation of error and uncertainty. Because these are plots of, if you do a regression between the error and uncertainty, the slope and the intercept, so the slope and the intercept, and it basically is constant across all measures of trial difficulty. No, that's just a toy example. Yeah, that's just a cartoon, as they say. Yeah, anyway, so the meat of the prediction, or the models I was talking about, was how does these quantities that I talked about earlier, error, uncertainty, and the correlation between the two, depend as a function of the stimulus presentation time. And so we have multiple presentation times here on the x-axis. This blue is the uncertainty, red is the error, and the green is the correlation between the two. And basically, there's not much we can formally say right now, except for that this correlation graph has some odd structure to it. There's some really big dip, but then it eventually rises, and we only see that some sort of transient dip behavior and things like that in our sampling model. Now, that's not at all any scientific model fit-in or anything like that. That's still work to be done. But at least we're taking this in, so maybe there might be something going on that the brain may be doing sampling in some manner.
Definitely
Yeah.
evidence integration, right?
Well, not exactly, because it may, but we have to make sure that it could be a combination of the two, because they're not necessarily mutually exclusive and things like that.
Sure, but at least it rolls out just the evidence integration.
I mean, from the picture, yes. Yeah, but
Because it should be getting lower, not necessarily exponentially like that, or I mean asymptotically, but it should be getting lower with the time.
yeah, but I mean, basically, we want to say that at least it appears that there may be some role, the sampling may be playing some role. But I think you have to do some sort of model comparison to see how much more likely the sampling model is compared to the evidence integration and things like that.
Have you thought about, like you said, a combination of methods? Have you thought about maybe if beyond, below a certain threshold they use one method and above a certain threshold they use another method or something like that?
I mean, I think I've thought about it, but the hard part is, with the, you know, how could you, with the brain, if these are general measures of computing distributions and representing probability, how would we, would it really mean that we have two different ones? Somehow we're capable of using two different processes and we are able of switching between the two whenever we want. I mean, maybe, but that's a...
No, whatever we want based on like how fast you're showing them.
Like, I don't know, based on like when you don't get as good of input, maybe there's one that becomes more efficient or cost effective or whatever than the other one.
That's true. That may be true. I think I think there's pretty strong evidence for evidence integration occurring in some manner. So perhaps, you know, very early on, there's evidence integration, but maybe we're not doing it exactly. There may be other things going on too, I think.
Sorry, minor question. So it seems to me that maybe I just can't see, but the error actually goes up from like 400 to 600 milliseconds.
Yeah, it does. I think it's just the task is hard, and sometimes maybe after a long time, there's variability in how the subjects perform, and yeah, it's not ideal. You'd think that they should get better, but that's part of the problem. The data is...
The error bars are pretty big.
At 400 and 600, not 400 and 600.
For here, at least those aren't very big, but we're getting more data, and people and collaborators are going to be analyzing it soon, so hopefully it'll be... Part of the problems with this is when I'm at least not as convinced with how reliable everything we have so far is. So we would like to get more data, and hopefully there wouldn't be these increases at the end.
Well, that actually might be something interesting.
It might be. It might be.
I have no idea.
Yeah, that's true. It could be interesting. So the future work is looking at how these, extending certain more models, but also comparing what we get in the data versus what we get in the predictions and seeing which model is more likely. So I'll really quickly, actually, I'm not sure how much more people want to listen, but I have a few slides, because I haven't even really talked about the theory, the models that we have, but I can go through them really quickly. Basically, let's just say, go back to the probability distributions where we say there's some stimulus to be estimated in the environment, and given an observation, we represent a posterior distribution over that stimulus. And this distribution has certain quantities, has its moments, its mean, variance, higher order moments. And for a consistent probabilistic representation, the true value of the stimulus should behave as if it sampled from this distribution. So we're looking at this probability of x given d based on certain moments of the distribution, this posterior. And we can think of this variance as kind of the difficulty of a trial. If you have a really high variance, that means you're very uncertain, and you have a higher error, and we can think of that we control that implicitly. So we even say, so this variance is also governed by a probability distribution with its own moments, and we have a measure of saying how the trial difficulty varies across trials, which is this omega squared. But the main thing is we don't have any assumptions about how these probability distributions may be initially emerged, or what sort of form they would have to take. Basically, they just have to have finite moments, and there's no other assumptions in the model besides the fact that somehow we're representing probability distribution. So,
Don't you still need some like non-parametric assumptions about like continuity or smoothness or something?
yeah, I think so. But basically, we're also not saying how this is generated in any way or anything. It's just somehow we're saying there's something there, which is a whole other problem as how this would be generated in the first place. But so initially, we say there's something there. And you can imagine if we represent a probability distribution exactly, to minimize our expected error, squared error across trials, we would a subject would report their mean of the posterior distribution as their estimate of the stimulus, and their uncertainty as their variance. And basically, I would just say given these things, we can derive expected equations for the error and correlation between error and uncertainty. And then we use this to look at the two different processes of evidence integration and sampling. For evidence integration, basically, you start with the posterior and you collect more data points. And as you collect more data points, this posterior converges onto the true stimulus in the environment, basically the moments scale as 1/n, and you eventually get to the exact value. And then in sampling, we say instead of having this distribution converge as you collect more evidence points, you say that the role of time is to just collect samples, and the subject reports their sample mean as their estimate of the stimulus and the sample variance as their uncertainty report. So there's a lot more to these models. I didn't want to talk about them too much because I have trouble explaining them myself whenever I try. But yeah. So that's basically the end. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll say that we are working more on developing more of the models, especially with evidence integration. We're developing new models, and we're looking at collecting more data and seeing how the results, doing official model comparison and fitting to see which models more likely represent the data and things like that. And I'll finally just acknowledge my collaborators. First is my advisor, Mate Langiel. We're part of the Computational Biological Learning Lab, which does stuff in neuroscience, computational neuroscience, and machine learning. If you're interested, it's just learning.eng.cam.ac.uk. And also my advisor, we collaborate with people in Hungary, and so they're there. And also, I'd like to thank Churchill College for hosting me, and the Winston Churchill Scholarship for funding me for this year. All right, thank you. Any questions?